I get what you're saying. So I think, to go straight for an answer to your question, because do you remember last time you asked me a question, I didn't answer it, did I? Do you remember? I was like, there's no one here. I was in one of those moods. But I want to answer your question today. I think this will be helpful to give you some potential insight. So let's see if what I'm saying is true for you. You can let me know. You can give me feedback. But it's a bit of, you said, is it projection, or are you just very sensitive to other people's energies or emotions? So when you interact with somebody, if you're sensitive, if your feelings on the physical, on the body level, on the mental level are open, you can sense where someone's coming from to a large degree. You can sense animosity behind a smile. You can sense love in eye contact, depending what's happening. You can sense pain. You can sense joy in another person. It's not for me to say this is what's happening for you. It's for you to tell me if I'm right or not, because I don't always get these things right. But my sense of what's happening with you is that you are very sensitive to other people. You do have a kind of, you could say, a sixth sense as to what's happening with other people. And at the same time, they're triggering your own emotions. So any unresolved stuff, emotional stuff in you is being triggered by them and being amplified. And that's why it's so difficult, potentially. So there's a combination of a sensitive soul, and pain in you. Because when we say unresolved issues, we're talking about deeper levels of pain, suffering. And they're often not conscious. No matter how much you think about it or try and reason it out, you often can't solve that kind of level of issue until you go right down into the feeling level in the body, and then gain insight, allow that feeling to express, and then it will teach you about itself once it's expressed. So that's my sense. Now, in terms of how to deal with it, grounding practices are going to be very important. And grounding practices means essentially you focus into something stable. That's going to be different depending where you're at. For some people, it will be like literally the ground. They will focus on planting their feet on the ground, or if you're sitting down, planting your bottom and your legs or whatever part of your body is in contact with the ground, and really feeling the ground and developing an energetic relationship with the earth. For other people, it'll be the breath, or a mantra, or some other kind of anchor that's anchoring them. Or for somebody else, it could be awareness. It could be the sense, if they're keyed into the sense of that which knows and that which sees. Do you know what I'm talking about? Did you say you're an air sign? Because this is actually, if in terms of the elements, this is actually water. In terms of that model or that way of looking at things, it's water. It's the emotions and the feelings that are being triggered. The air's there too, but the air is actually quite clean and pure, like space. And it's our intellectual tendency, whereas it's the water which can wash us from one side to the other when there's an imbalance there. And when the imbalance goes, it can still be very overwhelming, other people's emotions, other people's feelings, but you're just able to control it more. You're just able to control it more. But when there are issues with you, basically those are getting triggered and they get amplified, and it makes it even more difficult to deal with, especially if you're very sensitive. I mean, I'm fairly sensitive to these things, but I don't think I'm that sensitive. I can pick up a lot of emotions and things, but I think the fact that I'm not as sensitive as other people I've met has been beneficial to me, because it's meant that it's not been too overwhelming for me when your heart opens and other people, all this information, other people's feelings, energies come in, it can be very disorientating. Yeah, so a lot of it is emotional stuff. It might be good emotion, having good emotional support, somebody you can talk to, somebody you could, when you go through an experience like this, is there anyone you can talk to about it? If there's no one you can talk to about it, if you can write, journal about it, because there's a debriefing aspect. You know, if someone's been through a really difficult experience, they can talk about that experience afterwards, and if they're able to explore and talk about that afterwards, some people call that debriefing. So like if you in the army, they call that debriefing. If you've gone to an army mission afterwards, you're like debriefed, you can have a chat about it, and in that debriefing aspect, you're reviewing what's happened and you're allowing yourself to sort out what's happening, and you can gain insight into that process and you can learn from it essentially and adapt, and it helps you next time. You can grow. There are ways of desensitizing. Again, I'm not an expert on this because this is more about emotional energies and psychic energies. But there are ways. There are there are protections and things like this you can do. They can, and again, I'm not an expert on this kind of stuff. I briefly explored this kind of area, but for me, it wasn't in that, because I wasn't that sensitive to it. It didn't bother me that much, and because it didn't bother me that much, I didn't need to learn how to protect myself so much. And there's always been a very strong grounding energy with Tom, so he's been quite fortunate in that sense that there's negatives to it as well. There's always pluses and minuses to everything, but one of the positives for me was the groundedness was there. I mean, as I said, there are issues with that as well. It was difficult for me, for example, to access a lot of my feelings and emotions, because my ability to feel and express was somewhat stunted. So that's something that's over the last sort of 15 years or whatever has changed over time. Now, it doesn't have to take that amount of time, but yeah, you might have to look into how you can protect yourself. Maybe, go onto YouTube or do some research or talk to some people. But there are sort of protective rituals and things you can do to help shut down that excess sensory input, to put it that way, that excess emotional overwhelming, that thing that can happen. My sense is you shouldn't just allow this. This would be destructive for you. Okay. It'll be if it's too much. If you're feeling overwhelmed, it's too destructive. So this is why traditionally, this is the problem with the radical non-dual teachings. And I think a lot of people have this difficulty with it. Essentially, it can unhinge you. When you start allowing everything in, it can be very overwhelming, and if that's happened very quickly, it can be disorientating and destructive. It's too quick a change. So this is why traditionally these teachings are taught after a period of stabilization and purification first. The idea is that you don't have to, but the idea is it's generally speaking, so it doesn't apply to everyone, but generally speaking, it's better to be emotionally mature, grounded, and have a good number of your emotional issues resolved before you start opening yourself up to the radical non-dual teachings that there's nobody here, there's no self. Because if you haven't, when the no self teachings come in, it just blasts you open, and it's a shock to the system. And if you've got stuff that's unresolved, that stuff, it's like taking the brakes off. Before you're able to control it, you're the brakes on. You're slowing it down. Now the brakes are off, it just goes all over the place and it's overwhelming. And you see, it wreaks havoc in people's lives. They go through divorces. They go through, their work-life balance completely goes. They lose their ability to have an income, a financial income, and look after themselves. Now, sometimes that's just the way it is for people. Sometimes there's good that comes out of that, and there's learning that comes out of that. So it's not all bad. But traditionally, the teachings are there to make it as pleasant, make awakening as pleasant a process as possible. That's why these teachings, like this book here, it says in Tibet, the Dzogchen teachings are regarded as the highest and most esoteric teachings. Why are they the highest? It's like a stepwise teaching. They're the highest because at the end of all this other stuff, then you get to that bit at the end. Not because it's the best, but because in that order, if you do it in that order, then you get the least amount of suffering. The reality is most of us don't do it in that order. I mean, I didn't. So you get this sort of back and forth between purification and insight, purification and insight. So I would say if something's overwhelming for you, then suppress it. But do it knowingly, and do it knowing that eventually you're going to have to allow it to express and allow yourself to feel it, because this might sound a bit corny now. You've got to feel to heal. Yeah, I like that. You've got to feel to heal. Sound like someone from Oprah or something. But yeah, you got for the healing of these sort of physical and psychic and psychological issues, we've got to allow them to come up eventually. But I give the people an example. Like if you're in a business meeting, you're in a work meeting, and suddenly these emotions are coming up, just suppress them for that meeting. Yeah, because it's not appropriate. And you're in a workplace, you're in a business meeting. Say, now's not the time to go through some inner emotional work and start, having whatever it is, tears and physical convulsions, or whatever you're feeling. Just suppress it. Go home. When you're in a place when you can deal with it, then you can deal with it. Now that metaphor can be expanded for the whole of your life. If you're going through instead of an office meeting, which might last a couple of hours, if you're going through a phase in your life, a particularly stressful phase in your life, that's maybe 3 months long or 4 months long, then you might need to suppress it for 3 months or 4 months. Now, every time you suppress an emotion, it has a consequence. But it might be that consequence is better than the consequence of not suppressing it. So as long as you do it knowingly, then I think you're minimizing the dangers and you're acting in an intelligent way. But eventually we've got to deal with all our shit. So it's just a matter of timing, when. And it's best to, you can deal with stuff when you're healthy. When you're healthy, your best place to deal with things. So sometimes what you've got to do is take a break, meaning not deal with things. Take a break, take some time out, replenish yourself, heal yourself, strengthen yourself, and then from that place of strength, you can deal with issues. You're very welcome. As I sometimes say, the questions create the teachings. I mean, I would never have spoken about that kind of stuff if you hadn't asked me. And if no one asked me that, I probably would never speak about that stuff. Because it's not a default part of the way I teach. But the teaching's there if someone asks.